What's fueling the rise of extremism in the US? The number of radical groups there grew last year, and hateful rhetoric entered the mainstream of American politics. How is the public debate framing the government's response? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zaidan. Whether in San Bernardino, Colorado Springs or Charleston, communities across the US last year saw a big increase in violence from what's described as domestic extremists. The rise was accompanied by often inflammatory and hateful rhetoric from mainstream political leaders. The demonization of Latinos, Muslims, immigrants and others became commonplace, all amplified by voices in the right-wing media. Well, it's perhaps no surprise then that the number of hate groups in the US continues to grow. New research from the Southern Poverty Law Center says the number of hate groups rose by 14% in 2015. They include a whole range of groups with different ideologies that the center has mapped out nationwide. Well, as you can see, most of them are in the east and south of the US, ranging from anti-immigrant organizations to black separatists and white supremacists. The Southern Poverty Law Center says the state with the largest number of hate groups is Texas. It has a total of 84. Let's bring our guests into the show then. We have joining us from New York, Faiza Patel, co-director of Liberty and National Security at the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University. And in Vancouver, Anthony McLear, executive director of Life After Hate. Welcome to you both. I say ladies first. Let's start then with Faiza, shall we? Is what is called extremism really increasing in the US?
Well, I think certainly the Southern Poverty Law Center thinks so, and they've certainly put out this report which shows a rise in hate groups. But, I always think that extremism is a very difficult thing to define. And so one can look at the sort of atmosphere in a country and try and come up with a sort of a judgment as to what's happening. And I think the Southern Poverty Law Center does a good job of that. And certainly one of the things we've seen in the last year in the course of this presidential campaign has been very inflammatory rhetoric that has been directed at particular portions of the population over here. And that certainly gives everyone the feeling over here that there's something very wrong.
Well, the critics, Faiza, of this report would say that it was a little too, shall we say, flexible in determining and defining who's an extremist and which groups are extreme. I mean, is there something to be said for that, the over-branding of conservative groups as extremists, or, is the Poverty Law Center really onto a winning streak here?
Well, I mean, I think there is obviously some issue, right? Whenever a report like this comes out and you're trying to get your arms around a concept as slippery as extremism, there's going to be controversy about how you define it. That being said, I do think that one of the things that we've seen in the United States is that so-called right-wing extremism is generally underreported and valued in a sense. It's not considered to be as great a threat as violence that comes in the name of Al-Qaeda or in the name of Islam. So in that sense, I do think that the report does highlight something that law enforcement has been highlighting for a long time, and that the statistics certainly bear out. We have about as many fatalities since 9/11 from right-wing extremism in the United States as we do from Al-Qaeda/ISIS type violence. So I think there's an important message over there. On
that point, Anthony, now the Southern Poverty Law Center is not the only group that's talking about the rise in extremism. The Anti-Defamation League says not only extremism is rising, but perhaps becoming more deadly. They say domestic extremist killers, that's the term they use, slew more people in 2015 than in any year since 1995.
Absolutely, I would agree with that. And just to comment a little bit on the statistics Faye has brought out, if you look at post 9/11 and you take out the statistics of the San Bernardino massacre, it was a 2-to-1 ratio of domestic white terrorists murdering people in the United States versus Islamic terrorists. So certainly the violence and the rhetoric is there, and it seems to be picking up pace.
It's worrying, and an FBI report, a lot of it depends, Anthony, doesn't it, on what years you look at and how you define things. An FBI report tracking terrorist attacks, as they called it, on US soil between 1980 and 2005 found that 94% were committed by non-Muslims. Now, you were a member of a group called White Aryan Resistance. Tell us, how much attention do members of groups like that feel they get in terms of scrutiny, in terms of surveillance, and so on and so forth from the law enforcement agencies?
I think quite a bit. I think when I was active, and I was active for 15 years and with a variety of groups, I came from a time that was pre-internet and then into the internet. And in the pre-internet time, everything was about public meetings, and we sort of moved away from that because we knew that everything was infiltrated, and I became a very vocal proponent of what we call leaderless resistance and the lone wolf, that move away from the surveillance, move away from the groups where you can be identified, work in anonymity, train yourself, obtain weapons, and prepare for a racial war, and that lone wolf activity seems to be the more popular or more frequent way that the real serious murders and such take place.
Interesting. Faiza, are authorities addressing the threat of violence and what's called violent extremism or terrorism and their ideologies proportionately? In other words, putting the resources where the real threat lies. You spoke a moment ago about how one type of quote-unquote extremism is undervalued versus another.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great question. And I think generally speaking in the United States, when people talk about terrorism and when they talk about violent extremism, it almost always comes with the prefix Muslim, right? Because that's what people are talking about. And last year, I think that people started to kind of wake up with the Dylan Roof shooting in Charleston, South Carolina, to the fact that there are other kinds of terrorism out there, and the statistics do show that is and there are different ways people count it, so the statistics are a little bit different. But at the very least, you're looking at a threat that's about equivalent. But your prosecutions for terrorism, you'll find in the United States, are overwhelmingly towards Al-Qaeda/ISIS type terrorism. And the reason for that is the way that our laws are structured. So our laws actually call something terrorism much more easily if it has some kind of international or foreign connection. So regardless of the level of violence, any support for a designated foreign terrorist organization, even if it's sometimes something as little as translating a text that organization has put online, counts as terrorism. So obviously when your definition of terrorism is that broad, you're going to capture a lot of people in that net, and so it's going to look like when you're prosecuting that the biggest threat is actually coming from Al-Qaeda or ISIS or these kinds of groups.
Is it just a matter of how broad the laws are? Because that same principle you could apply to many groups, whether they're radical far right, white supremacist, the idea of providing material support. Why does it get focused more so on groups that purport to fight or commit acts in the name of Islam rather than others?
Because that's the way our law is. The material support statute only criminalizes support for a designated foreign terrorist organization. Mm-hmm. It's a list that the State Department keeps. And actually, that makes sense, right? Because who are you going to designate domestically as a terrorist organization? If there's a terrorist organization in the United States, they're going to get shut down. They're not going to get on a list and people get pursued for providing material support. So I think that's kind of where the discrepancy comes out in terms of prosecutions.
Okay, go ahead, Anthony. You wanted to get in there.
Yeah, I wanted to say that, and I think part of it is we don't like to look in the mirror and see ourselves in the same light as the other. I think there's that element to it. We don't want to admit that we are capable of committing those types of acts coming from our own community. It's always another community.
Anthony, why is extremism
increasing?
increasing? The report talks about the increasing number of KKK chapters in the US. It talks about a 14% increase in anti-government or anti-state groups. Why?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons. I think when people are facing in certain uncertainty, and certainly economics has something to do with that, they want to look for simple solutions as to why that's happening, and it's very easy and convenient to scapegoat and point to the other in search of blame. And when you have the rhetoric coming from politicians, and the politicians haven't created the Islamophobia that seems to be taking grip on this continent. They've merely tapped into it and given it a voice. It was always there. It just didn't have a voice to bring it forward. And so when that happens, I think when you change where the middle is, and the middle certainly is shifting towards Islamophobia, you also make the extreme more radical and such. So when you change where the middle is, you change where the end is, and vice versa. And I think that's certainly a phenomenon that's happening.
Fascinating. And on that point, Anthony, let's just comment on one thing you mentioned there as well. As you might remember, in November, the US presidential hopeful Donald Trump tweeted this. Now, he posted an image with inaccurate, I do say inaccurate, murder figures in the US. The one statistic that stands out is the number of whites killed by black people at 81%. And this supposed source for this information was the Crime Statistics Bureau, which actually doesn't exist. And interestingly, the FBI, just so we get our facts straight on this show, the FBI says the real number for whites killed by blacks is only 15%. Faiza, on the point which Anthony was mentioning there, is a type of thought and ideology that maybe, I don't know, 5-10 years ago would have been considered extremism, now considered part of the mainstream?
Well, I mean, I think Anthony's exactly right that when the center moves, the extremes also moved. And clearly the center has moved as well. And I think he's right as well that politicians aren't, making this up. They're tapping into a vein of feeling within the United States. But I think it's also important to figure out, why is this over here, right? So it's very easy. We have all of these wars going on in Muslim countries, and the fact that you're at war with people somewhere always makes it, increases the pressure on people who are perceived to be like those at home. And we've seen this over history. We saw this with the Germans, we saw this with the Japanese in World War II. So there's definitely that element of it. But part of it, honestly, I think, is that we have, domestic policies here put forward by our government, implemented by our law enforcement, that actually do treat Muslims as a suspect community. And if the government is treating Muslims as a suspect community, if you have police departments like in New York who are, surveilling Muslim communities on a very, very broad level, then I think it's not surprising that combined with our wars makes people think, wow, there's something scary about these people.
What about the other groups which seem to be also suffering, Faiza, from increasing numbers of extremist attacks and hate? We're seeing numbers increasing in other communities and minorities, Latinos, blacks. I mean, what's the explanation for that then?
Well, I mean, I think my recollection is if you look at hate crimes, the biggest number of hate crimes is generally anti-Semitic hate crimes, right? Generally, if you look at the DOJ statistics, at least, anti-Semitic hate crimes make up the largest number. And then from there, if you look at it, then it's African Americans and then other minorities come lower down. And I prefer to kind of look at those statistics rather than sort of broader ideas of sort of what's extremism and what's not. I think that Anthony's right, that it's a time of economic uncertainty where sort of the traditional bases of economic power are dwindling for the majority. And it's a time of demographic change in the United States as well. We are, fast going to becoming a majority-minority country. I believe the projection is certainly by the middle of this century So not only is economic power in sort of the traditional white middle class and working class diminishing, but so is political power. And all of these changes are huge. And people do, I think, as Anthony said, react to them by sort of glomming on to somebody to blame for this and looking for easy fixes.
Fascinating. Anthony, do you think part of the problem as well is how you define attacks or violence, whether you call it terrorism or whether you call it simply a hate crime, that puts it in a different context that attracts more or perhaps less attention and efforts to combat it?
I think so. When you look at the case of Dylan Roof, you know, they were very reluctant for law enforcement to refer to it as an act of terror. You know, if it was a mosque blown up in another part of the world, it's clearly an act of terror. If someone walks into a church and murders the people that are in there on the basis of race, it's a hate crime. It's an act of terror as far as I'm concerned, and I think we need to start looking at these things on an equal basis.
We do need to start. Faiza, is the solution to label more hate crimes as terror attacks or take the terminology out? What would you advocate?
So I wouldn't start, prosecuting hate crimes as terrorism. I think our definition of terrorism is already far too broad. What I would do is reserve the terrorism label for something that truly was terrorism, where you truly had a foreign terrorist organization that was directing operationally an attack on U.S. soil. That's terrorism. Everything else, I think, should be treated equally, at least as far as the law is concerned. But if we are going to label, not even violence, but non-violence that's carried out because you want to support a foreign terrorist organization as terrorism, then I think the equality argument starts to have some legs.
Anthony, who gets to frame the debate? Is it the media? Is it the politicians? Who ultimately? Is it the legal experts and lawyers of the Department of Justice? Who decides ultimately if this is a terror attack, if this gets labelled a hate crime and goes through the criminal process and so on?
I think it's a case of shifting frames depending on who's speaking. I think from from a pure technical legal perspective, there's a very strict definition of what a hate crime is in terms of harassment and assaults and that type of thing, and things have to fit within that frame for maybe that department. Politicians, of course, they have a much broader frame with which to define things, and will shift that frame towards their own political needs. And I'm not sure that you can come up with one simple frame that's going to explain all, but it's something I think that we personally need to do and have discussion about.
And on that point of the situation potentially being interpreted for political expediency, of course, one thing or one quote that does come to mind is the Republican presidential hopeful Ted Cruz, what he said when he said, quote, "There is no meaningful risk of Christians committing acts of terror. If there were a group of radical Christians pledging to murder anyone who had a different religious view than they, would have a very different national security situation." On that point, it's worth taking a look at these figures, though, from the New America Foundation, which show, as Faiza was pointing out, that if you take the number of attacks committed by what's termed violent jihadist groups, they're actually less than what was committed by radical far-right, what's termed as far-right groups, between 2001 and 2015. It makes you wonder, Anthony, to what extent does the statements of politicians, the public discourse, feed and shape public policy?
Well, I think we live in an age where most people are getting their news and information, from television and the internet, and it's all in sound bites. And in the case of Donald Trump, he doesn't even have to be using correct statistics for it to have an effect. And it's, we can, look at Goebbels and the big lie. If you say something over and over again, people will accept it as truth. And I think we've lost our ability to have critical thinking and to really dig deep and examine what's truly going on. With regards to Ted Cruz, I think history shows that every group is capable of acts of terror against other communities based on faith, race, or political stripe.
Are we, Faiza, though, are we actually seeing, is there any evidence to suggest, though, that law enforcement agencies, how they target, what they focus on, the groups that they put their resources into, is actually impacted and shaped by where they think public opinion stands? If they think that public opinion is against Muslims, or perceives, because of a Donald Trump tweet, perceives black people as potentially more dangerous. Does that feed into what law enforcement actually does?
I think that they set their priorities in terms of what they consider to be the greatest threat at some level, on a systemic level. And I hope that they do so on the basis of the statistics rather than on the basis of what's published in the newspapers. But, you know, sometimes I do worry a little bit that the fact that we do have this kind of almost exclusive focus on Al-Qaeda and ISIS terrorism means that right-wing terrorism gets short shrift. But we do know, for example, like a recent survey of local law enforcement agencies, so the police departments in the United States, you know, far more of them rated right-wing terrorism as the biggest threat in their communities than Al-Qaeda or ISIS-inspired terrorism. So there's that. So there's clearly a recognition over there. I think at the federal level, the story is perhaps a little bit different, and there has been a really almost single-minded focus on one variant of terrorism. But I feel like, especially over the course of the last 6 to 8 months, you know, even in the federal side, people have been kind of waking up to the idea of maybe that they should be thinking more broadly about terrorism. But we haven't seen any implementation of these views.
Anthony, how do you counter extremist ideology, whether we're talking about people who interpret religion, Islam in an extreme way, or white culture and white power? I mean, you have an inside view. You mentioned that people were going towards the internet. I think that's maybe also true for groups that are, you know, so-called violent Islamic groups. How do you counter that sort of ideology spreading online?
Well, we work more one-on-one with people with our Exit USA program, and I can tell you that in seeing the number of people that I have that have left extremist groups, it's not an intellectual debate that often changes their minds. It's actually receiving compassion, particularly from someone that they don't feel that they deserve to receive it from. It's an incredibly powerful thing, and you know, the statistics and stuff are there as well. And I think that we have to recognize that the people that join extremist groups, they didn't come into this world as extremists. They weren't born extremists, and somewhere along the way, something's gone wrong. The research says that the number one correlated factor for people joining extremist groups is a history of childhood trauma, whether that be emotional, physical, or sexual, and that's what leads people, that anger, that sense of toxic shame that they're not good enough. That leads them to go and seek out validation, acceptance, and those type of things for joining groups. And so while early childhood trauma may not be a great predictor, and it really isn't, in terms of helping people get out of extremist groups, when we focus on those areas which Life After Hate, that's the area that we focus on to help people. Once we can change that and deal with it with compassion, the ideology can no longer stand when the compassion and the open heart is within the person.
Interesting, Anthony. We wish you all the best with that effort. Let's also thank our guests very much for their contributions, Faiza Patel and Anthony McLear. And thank you for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Or you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zaidan, and the whole team, for now, it's goodbye.